You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What you see Haudenosaunee people in the 17th and 18th century doing is not only do settler traders very specifically cater to specific items of dress like leggings, like moccasins, like specific kinds of shirts that Haudenosaunee people want, but then after bringing them home, Haudenosaunee women would decorate them. Brian Broadrose, who's a Haudenosaunee archaeologist of Haudenosaunee town sites, calls this the first punk remix culture, which I really like.
Hello, and welcome to episode 406 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Historians use a lot of different sources when they research the past. Many historians, in fact, I'd wager to say most historians, rely on primary source documents. Documents that were written by official government bodies, or those who were written by the people we're studying, or those who witnessed the events and change that we're studying. But how do you uncover the stories and the voices of people who didn't know how to write or whose families simply didn't preserve much of their writing? This is a particular problem when we study the histories of women. Even among women who did know how to write, their families often didn't preserve or keep their writings. So historians who study women usually have to read between the lines of records created and maintained by men, and they have to examine other types of primary sources. Maeve Kane, an associate professor of history at the University at Albany and author of the book Shirts Powdered Red, ran into this very problem as she sought to recover the lives of Haudenosaunee women. Now, Maeve encountered several challenges in researching this kind of project, as the Haudenosaunee peoples honor an oral tradition for keeping their histories, so they weren't in the practice of keeping written records during the 17th and 18th centuries. Plus, the written records that exist about the Haudenosaunee for this period are often accounts kept by white men who often held racist views about indigenous peoples. So how did Maeve uncover and recover the lives of Haudenosaunee women? She looked at different types of material sources, the goods that Haudenosaunee women trade for, used, and created. Specifically, Maeve uncovered the lives of Haudenosaunee women by looking at the cloth they traded for and the clothing that they made and wore. Now, during our exploration of Haudenosaunee women and the trade they conducted, Maeve reveals information about Haudenosaunee communities in the 17th and 18th centuries and women's roles in those communities. Details about cloth and clothing as historical sources, and what these sources can reveal to us about the politics and economic prowess of Haudenosaunee women, and the important role Haudenosaunee women played in the 17th and 18th century trade with Europeans, and the ways that they used that trade, cloth, and clothing to keep Haudenosaunee culture alive and vibrant. But first, today we'll be speaking about the Haudenosaunee peoples within the context of the 17th and 18th centuries. But it's important to remember, it's vital to remember, that the peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, are still here. The descendants of the historical people we're talking about today still live amongst us, mostly in New York, Canada, and parts of the upper Midwest. Now, I've included links to present-day tribes in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the show notes, so that you can explore and learn more about the Haudenosaunee in their own words. To access these links, visit benfranklinsworld.com/406. All right, are you ready to travel back in time to the 17th and 18th centuries and explore Haudenosaunee trade and the important part that women played in that trade? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is an associate professor of history at the University at Albany. Her research focuses on questions of community and identity formation, and she uses material culture, archaeology, economic history, and digital history to examine those questions. She's also the author of the book Shirts Powdered Red, Haudenosaunee Gender, Trade, and Exchange Across 3 Centuries. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Maeve Kane.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you, because we know this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Now, in your book, Shirts Powdered Red, you investigate the ways that Haudenosaunee women are central to keeping Haudenosaunee culture and political power alive within their communities. The Haudenosaunee have fascinated scholars for many, many years. So how did you become interested in the Haudenosaunee people and culture, and specifically in the lives and work of Haudenosaunee women?
So I'm not Indigenous. I'm not Haudenosaunee myself. I'm a white lady from Minnesota. When I was starting out in grad school looking for a dissertation topic, I was really interested in clothing. I had a Felicity doll, an American Girl doll when I was a kid, and I was really interested in Barbies and paper dolls and things like that. And what I thought I was going to write my dissertation and then, eventually book on was a comparison of how white, free and enslaved Black and Indigenous women used clothing in the 18th century as a way of thinking about there is and was this huge literature on race and nation formation and all of these kind of big intellectual ideas, mostly from the perspective of elite white men in the 18th century. And I had several jobs in museums, internships in curation departments, and I had this childhood interest in doll clothes. And I thought it would be interesting to look at clothing as a way that women specifically were thinking about their own identities, their families' identities, their places in their communities. I stayed with that idea. Obviously, clothing is a huge part of the book, but I ended up focusing on Haudenosaunee women in what's now New York and Southern Canada specifically because there was just so much there. I was really confronted with that there was this kind of general knowledge of Haudenosaunee women's importance in the 18th century and currently, but there wasn't a lot of really specific academic scholarship about what that importance meant. So I ended up using clothing as a way to kind of dig into some of those questions and think about how were Haudenosaunee women thinking about themselves in this broader Atlantic context.
Well, speaking of context, so that we can best see how Haudenosaunee women fit within their communities and the ways that they've been able to use cloth and clothing to assert their power and keep their cultural traditions alive, would you tell us about the Haudenosaunee? How did they structure their societies in the 18th century, and where should we place their homelands on our mental maps of North America?
Sure. I think the most important thing is that Haudenosaunee people and nations are still here. They still occupy their historic territories in what's now New York and Southern Canada. The 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee include the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. Structurally, so in the 18th century and currently, the Haudenosaunee are a matrilineal culture. That means that the way that a person belongs to their community, to their nation, is through their mother's line. So people's clan and their national belonging descends through their mother rather than through their father. In contact with Europeans, this sometimes created a little bit of conflict or confusion in that the mother's brother or the uncle of a person is the most important male figure in a child's life. Whereas for patrilineal cultures like European cultures, a father is the most important person. And in diplomatic conversations, you see this sometimes conflict between who's called a father and who's called an uncle and how is that deployed. And I think that speaks to just the ways that this cultural disjunction kind of played out in contact situations.
The Haudenosaunee are a matrilineal society. So what kinds of roles did Haudenosaunee women serve in their communities during the 17th and 18th centuries when they were having regular contact with Europeans?
Haudenosaunee culture is structured a lot around ideas of balance and reciprocity. So the creation story really emphasizes balance between the human and non-human world. In governance and in community governance, there's a real emphasis on balance between men and women. It's not a matriarchal culture. It's not a culture where women rule, but it's a culture where women's voice in consensus-based governance is really important. And you see that play out. Men are often outward-facing in cultural interactions with Europeans in the 17th and 18th century, but there's a real emphasis in internal decision-making on the voice and the role of women. And you see this particularly after the American Revolution in the early 19th century, where Americans are really frustrated with the presence of Haudenosaunee women. They think that the presence of women means that the space is not political or not diplomatic. So they got really frustrated that Haudenosaunee people insisted on women's presence at treaty conferences because that voice and that consensus-based governance was so important.
Now, from your book, Shirts Powdered Red, we get the sense that two of the significant functions that Haudenosaunee women perform in their communities is this keeping a balance within their communities and keeping alive Haudenosaunee culture. Would you tell us more about women's work within the Haudenosaunee communities to keep their distinctive culture alive?
Yeah, so part of this is formal knowledge keeping. Women kept knowledge, kept oral histories the same way that men did. Women were also involved in the creation and keeping of wampum. Wampum is a really significant kind of diplomatic, political, mnemonic device. It's shell beads that are woven into belts or into strings and used as kind of a physical symbol of an agreement or an event. And women were the primary ones responsible for weaving and creating these wampum belts. And then there would be male wampum keepers. So women are involved in formal knowledge protection and creation. They're also involved in the domestic work of what we would call reproductive labor, of clothing families, taking care of children, educating children. That's not often thought of in explicit political formal terms, but is a really foundational part of like how cultures are transmitted. How do you learn how to be Haudenosaunee? How do you learn who your community is, who your nation is?
Well, you've mentioned clothing, so let's talk about clothing and cloth and how you were able to use these items as historical sources. So, as she mentioned, Maeve uses clothing and cloth to access the voices of Haudenosaunee women. Maeve, how and why do cloth and clothing serve as great historical sources and windows onto the Haudenosaunee past? How were you able to read and use cloth and clothing to better understand the lives and experiences of Haudenosaunee women during the 17th and 18th centuries?
Cloth and clothing are inherently political. So we're recording this right after the 2024 US presidential election. I think people understand the politics of clothing when it comes to things like slogans on hats or on t-shirts. It can be explicitly political in the words that are written on clothing. But clothing is often implicitly political in the way that it positions a person in their community. Like when you get dressed in the morning, you don't think about, I am going to make a political statement with this hoodie that was the last clean thing on the laundry pile. But people do understand if you show up to work in a blazer and jeans, that means something slightly different than a t-shirt and muddy track pants or whatever. So there are these implicit messages that we convey through our clothing that we make every single day. So for historians thinking about groups that might not have left a lot of their own written records, like marginalized and poor working class whites, enslaved Black people, Indigenous people, clothing can be a way of accessing what were the choices that those people were making on a daily basis. Why were they making those choices? There's some absolutely wonderful work done by Haudenosaunee scholars like Brian Rice and Susan Hill that get at these questions through oral history, and that's wonderful. I'm an archivally based historian, so when I was approaching this project, I was thinking about how can I access similar kinds of questions, think about where people are making their own choices, rather than there's a lot of written archival documentation written by outsiders describing what people wore. But how do you think about that in the read it against the grain of how are people making their own choices?
So before we get to the European contact period, what kinds of clothing and cloth were Haudenosaunee women using and making for their families and communities?
Prior to European contact, it's mostly things made out of animal hides, leather, fur, some feathers. There's some early descriptions by Europeans of turkey feathers woven into kind of a coat-shaped mantle. But people were doing things like sewing together 6 to 8 beaver hides in like a blanket or a mantle the size of like a twin-sized blanket. So you use that as kind of a wrap during the winter, a blanket when you're sleeping. Deer hides for wrapped leggings, wrapped skirts, moccasins, obviously, things like that.
And how did contact with Europeans change Haudenosaunee clothing and their traditional use of leather and leather skins for clothing?
Really early on in the early 17th century, right after Dutch, French, and later British people introduced cloth as a trade item, there's a lot of interest by Haudenosaunee people and other indigenous people in purchasing cloth. But one of the arguments that I make in the book is that they don't adopt it in really large scale, large numbers until the prices go down. There's this point in the mid 17th century where there's a tipping point in the sale prices. And that's when I think you see Haudenosaunee and other indigenous people adopt cloth in the place of these previous leather and hide garments. And that's because it becomes so labor saving. So there's this tipping point where instead of using 6 to 8 beaver hides to make one person's coat or blanket, you only need one beaver hide to buy a cloth blanket of the same size. So it's like with the same number of beaver hides, you can suddenly clothe 6 to 8 adults. with the same amount of furs. So it's a huge, just radical change in the amount of work that you need to clothe a family. And in the context of this is the same time that epidemic diseases are starting to affect Haudenosaunee communities and other Indigenous communities, the Mohawk scholar Susan Hill has made this argument about the labor necessary to support communities and sustain communities through this period shifts radically because of epidemic disease. So the argument that I make is that the drop in cloth prices makes it possible for families to sustain themselves in this context, makes it possible for Haudenosaunee nations to survive through that very critical period.
I was really struck when I read your book, Shirts Powdered Red, at the sheer amount of labor that could be saved by trading furs for European cloth. Would you tell us about the amount of labor that Haudenosaunee women invested in creating leather-based clothing, and also talk about the labor that they were able to save when they switched to cloth-based clothing after European contact?
So if you're looking at making garments out of leather or fur, you have the labor of hunting and trapping. That's primarily, for Haudenosaunee people, that's primarily men's work, but women would also travel. So hunting parties would often include whole families where you're setting up a seasonal camp for part of the fall and setting trap lines, hunting, etc. So you've got the first stage of the hunting, which takes up significant time. Then once the animal is trapped or hunted, you have to skin it. You have to smoke the leather. You have to tan the leather, prepare it so it stays nice and supple so that the hair doesn't fall out of the furs. And then you have to actually sew it together. And with leather sewing, you have to kind of make a hole with a bone awl and then use sinew to sew it together. And this is, you can't see it on the podcast, but I'm making like sewing gestures in the air right now. There is still labor there when garments are made out of cloth. Like anybody who's done any kind of sewing knows that. But being able to reduce or shift some of that work of hunting and have, in some cases, pre-made garments, ready-made garments available for purchase really radically shifts, and especially that drop in prices really radically shifts who's doing what kind of work where and how much they're doing.
When we spoke with Susan Sleeper-Smith about Indigenous demand for European manufactured cloth, before Indigenous people could really get access to the cloth that they wanted, they had to establish long-term trading relationships with Europeans. Would you tell us about the relationships that the Haudenosaunee had with the French, the Dutch, and the English colonies of the 17th and 18th centuries so we can get a better understanding of how they established long-term trading relationships with Europeans?
In a lot of ways, for the Haudenosaunee in the 17th and 18th century, trade was diplomacy and diplomacy was trade. That important ethic of reciprocity and balance that I mentioned coming out of the Haudenosaunee creation story is a underlying philosophical framework as part of this, where you see in a lot of diplomatic interactions in the 17th and 18th century this emphasis on the need for reciprocity and fair dealing in both trade and diplomacy, where you can't have a fair diplomatic situation if you have traders who are price gouging, basically. And you can't have trade if you don't have a friendly diplomatic relationship. So a lot of early diplomatic encounters really included this emphasis on the need, both trade as a show of respect, of willingness to exchange in safety. Like you see this in one of the first possible encounters in Haudenosaunee territory with the 1609 encounter between Hudson and either Mohican or Haudenosaunee people. They exchange food, they exchange goods, and it's this kind of token of fair dealing and safe dealing, that people are safe to exchange in this situation. And then in the 17th and 18th centuries, you see trade is kind of the thread that connects people, and pun intended there. Trade is meant as this conduit that keeps people tied together without one dominating the other because of the emphasis on reciprocity and balance.
As you were saying, trade and diplomacy often go hand in hand. And when we think about diplomacy and negotiations in the 18th century, it's likely that many of us are going to picture in our minds Benjamin Franklin going to France or John Adams going to the Netherlands and England to negotiate treaties of friendship and peace. But when we look at the Haudenosaunee context of diplomacy, women were actually very active in diplomatic negotiations. And this isn't something that we see with Europeans. We didn't see Benjamin Franklin and John Adams taking women into these negotiation rooms. They were interacting with other men. So would you tell us more about the involvement of Haudenosaunee women when the Haudenosaunee are conducting trade and diplomacy?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that consensus-based governance was so important. So in a lot of treaty situations in the 17th and 18th century, one of the expectations was that British, Dutch, French negotiating officials would offer a gift. And this is part of that token of it shows the seriousness of the intent that people have put forethought into this. Haudenosaunee would offer a gift of wampum in return as a symbol of this is a serious diplomatic negotiation that some thought has gone into. And the gifts from European negotiators to Haudenosaunee communities in this setting often included things that really specifically were intended for women. So things like needles, thimbles, children's shirts, women and children's stockings, things like that. And it's part of recognizing that the entire nation is part of this negotiation, that there has to be consensus broadly within the community or the nation in order for the treaty negotiations to be successful. And in a lot of ways, modern Haudenosaunee leaders talk about treaties as this sacred thing, that the process of the treaty negotiation itself is sacred. Wampum is a sacred item, so including that is part of this symbolic weight of people coming together. And then the terms of the treaty itself is sacred as well, because it's about this recognition of nationhood, it's recognition of the consensus and the good mind of the community in agreeing to the terms of that treaty.
And what about the role of women to facilitate these meetings of trade and diplomacy with food? It struck me that Haudenosaunee women prepared a lot of food to help make these diplomatic and trade meetings go smoothly.
I looked for that piece quite a bit, the question of how women are involved in preparing food. We know that they were there. We know that women were involved in preparing food, but they're often not visible in European written descriptions of it, so it's kind of hard to uncover that. The dish with one spoon is a really important political, philosophical metaphor in Haudenosaunee governance and philosophy. The dish with one spoon means that all people, from an ecological perspective, people use the common resources of the world, and the one spoon is you have to share, you have to take turns. And that's a metaphor that shows up in a lot of Haudenosaunee speeches in diplomatic contexts of the 17th and 18th century, and women are primarily responsible for preparing that food. Clan mothers and faith keepers in Haudenosaunee context were sometimes called the cooks of the chief, because they were responsible for preparing food for these large gatherings, both with outsiders and internally for Haudenosaunee communities. So food is a really important part of the metaphorical diplomacy that's at work and the physical diplomacy that's at work, and creating this space for this consensus governance and agreement to happen. But it's really hard to see archivally. So I don't have a lot of detail on how that actually worked on the ground, unfortunately.
So once the Haudenosaunee have established trade relationships, they've conducted all the diplomacy, and they have established these relationships that they need to conduct trade, what did they trade for? Stessa is curious to know what kinds of goods the Haudenosaunee traded for.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Stessa. So an earlier generation of scholarship, and I think kind of the stereotype of what the fur trade looks like, is that Native people were trading for guns and for alcohol. That's certainly a component of the trade. But when you look at both the numbers of things, items that people are actually buying, and the value, like the amount that they're spending on different categories of things, I think it should really more properly be called the cloth trade, because cloth is overwhelmingly the primary thing that Haudenosaunee people are interested in buying from European traders. And it's a huge range of things. It's yardage cloth, both linen and wool, almost like the cloth like yardage that you would buy from a fabric store now, like just cuts of cloth, but also ready-made things like linen shirts, later calico shirts, calico cotton printed shirts, ready-made leggings, so not knitted stockings the way that Europeans are wearing, but like cloth that has been sewn and wrapped to wrap around a leg, almost like a leg warmer. Sometimes coats, and sometimes even moccasins, like ready-made moccasins from European traders. And they're really specifically things that fit into Haudenosaunee contexts. These are not items of clothing for the most part, with the exception of coats that Europeans are wearing, but they're made by Europeans or settler traders specifically for sale to Haudenosaunee customers. So it's really this market created where these settler traders are catering very specifically to Haudenosaunee preferences in both the kinds of cloth that's being sold in colors and designs, and in the kinds of ready-made clothing that's available.
And what kinds of ready-made clothing were available to the Haudenosaunee through this trade?
That's part of the labor saving piece, I think, part of what made the cloth trade so attractive for Haudenosaunee people. So it varies over time and place to place and trader to trader. But things like the wrapped cloth leggings, so a rectangular piece of cloth wrapped around your lower leg from knee to ankle, shirts, white linen or colored cotton calico shirts, and 18th century men's European style coats are the primary things, as well as moccasins are the primary things that were available ready-made.
One of the interesting details in Maeve's book, Shirts Powdered Red, is that Haudenosaunee women didn't just wear this pre-made clothing or have their men wear this pre-made clothing as it came from their European trading partners. They actually modified this clothing so that it expressed their Haudenosaunee culture. Maeve, let's take a moment to talk about our sponsor, and when we get back, let's talk about how Haudenosaunee women made European clothing items Haudenosaunee clothing items. Do you ever feel like history is unfolding right before your eyes? Our present-day headlines and news articles are full of stories with connections to early American history. Introducing History Behind the Headlines, a brand new newsletter from Ben Franklin's World. Each issue uncovers the historical roots of today's biggest stories, helping you see the early American past in today's present. Stay informed, see connections, and think historically. Subscribe for free at benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter, because the past is always present. Maeve, how did Haudenosaunee women make European clothing items, those pre-made clothing items, Haudenosaunee?
So my colleague Brian Broadrose, who's a Haudenosaunee archaeologist of Haudenosaunee town sites, calls this the first punk remix culture, which I really like. And what you see Haudenosaunee people in the 17th and 18th century doing is not only do settler traders like very specifically cater to specific items of dress like leggings, like moccasins, like specific kinds of shirts that Haudenosaunee people want, but then after bringing them home, Haudenosaunee women would decorate them. The first image in my book is 18th century image of a Haudenosaunee woman wearing a lot of these ready-made clothing items. And she's decorated them with ribbons, with silver brooches. In other cases, you can see moose hair or porcupine quill embroidery added to items or worn alongside this ready-made items. And it becomes about the embellishments and the details. One of the things that I think the labor-saving component of buying cloth and clothing from European traders is so important is that it makes space for this very specifically Haudenosaunee style of embellishment, that this decorative work becomes a component of cultural sovereignty in the 18th century.
How shrewd were Haudenosaunee women when it came to trading? Did European men who were in charge of the European side of this trade ever try to take advantage of the fact that on the Haudenosaunee side, women were actually the ones in charge of negotiating for trade goods?
I think there's a real tension there. Part of the work that I do in the book is going through these itemized account books, which are specifically the name of who bought what, when, for how much. And half of the people buying from these European traders are women, so they can't be ignored. And you see that also in like the terms of the trade. Women don't get different prices. There doesn't seem to be any conflict over who's doing that trade. Specifically in New York, that's in part because under Dutch law, women could trade independently on their own, so that's part of it. But that's true in the English period and with English traders as well. So part of this is European traders can't ignore women's economic power. They trade on their own account in their own cultures. They bring a lot of furs and other things to market, so they kind of have to be dealt with. But the tension is the English take over New York in 1664, and after that, it's under English law. And what you see after that is over the course of the 18th century, Indigenous women lose their names in a lot of these account books. So like they're still there and they're still noted as these traders, but they less and less over the course of the 18th century are noted by their name. And they're often identified as so-and-so's wife, so-and-so's mother, things like that. So it's this tension between the on-the-ground reality that European traders needed to make money by trading with these women and trading with them on their own account. But there's this cultural sense that they're not really their own person. And I think that you can kind of see colonialism in action in that way.
In Shirts Powdered Red, you talk about the power that women built through trade, especially through the Albany-Montreal trade. For example, you discuss the remarkable stories of the Haudenosaunee sisters, the widow Daguenot, and different Haudenosaunee women and how they built trading empires. So would you tell us about these women and about the Albany-Montreal trade?
I love the Haudenosaunee. They're some of my favorites. So the British and the French in the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s, the British and French colonial governments would have really liked to make the trade between Albany and Montreal illegal. The problem was it was so wildly profitable on both ends. The Montreal side of the trade had this struggle with the monopoly on the New France side. All the French traders were supposed to be selling their furs out of New France through this monopoly corporation, and they were only supposed to be selling French cloth to native people. There was no monopoly on the British side, but they wanted access to this larger market of furs from the north, and they wanted to sell their cloth to more people. So what happens over the course of the mid-18th century is this secretive trade that's illegal for French people in New France to participate in. It's illegal for British and Dutch people in Albany to participate in, but it is not illegal for Haudenosaunee people to participate in because French and British law just can't apply to them because it's movement through their own territories. The governments of New France and New York have no jurisdiction there. So the way that Widow Dagno or the Haudenosaunee sisters come into this is they used Haudenosaunee couriers to conduct this trade. There's this couple of Mohawk women named Agnes or Therese who courier big caravans of canoes full of beaver pelts down from Montreal through the Champlain Valley, the Hudson Valley to Albany. They trade those pelts to Albany traders like Robert Sanders, who becomes mayor of Albany because he makes so much money on this trade. They sell those pelts to folks like Robert Sanders. He sells them cloth in return, and they take it back up to Montreal. And it makes a lot of money for everybody on all sides of the trade.
The trade may have made some people rich, but it also seemed to pose a really big problem for the French and British empires during the 7 Years' War because no one knew who to trust or who might be passing information on. So people really weren't supposed to be trading with either the French or the British while they were at war with each other.
Yeah, and it speaks to, I think, the enduring connections between Haudenosaunee communities in different places. So the British and French really wanted places like Kahnawake, for example, to be wholly British or wholly French. But Kahnawake really specifically insisted on the trade was part of their connection to their Mohawk Valley kin, communities like Canajoharie that remained in the Mohawk Valley of what's now New York, and that the British and French could not outlaw that trade because it was about Kahnawake and Canajoharie's connection to one another. And they couldn't. The Haudenosaunee connections, Haudenosaunee sovereignty was primarily important, and the British and French had no jurisdiction over that.
I also think it shows some Haudenosaunee ingenuity as well, because boundaries were and are fluid. They weren't just the lines that Europeans drew on maps, and the Haudenosaunee knew this, and they basically found a kind of loophole in European imperial law and used it to better their own communities through this trade.
Yeah, the Mohawk word for what's now the U.S.-Canadian border translates literally into English as where tracks are dragged. It's a line that has been dragged in snow by animal tracks. Like, it's not real. It's a thing that has just been drawn. So it has no legal reality for those communities.
Now, when we talk about trade between Indigenous peoples and Europeans, later Americans, as we're doing now, a lot of scholars have talked about an Indigenous dependency on European-produced goods. And they've portrayed this dependency as kind of an addiction, I guess we could say, where Indigenous peoples could not go back to their former ways of life after having access to all these new and novel goods like metal goods and clothing and some of the items that we've been talking about. Maeve, as someone who has studied the Haudenosaunee trade extensively, would you tell us whether you saw any signs of Haudenosaunee dependency on European goods and whether dependency and this idea of dependency is still a framework or lens through which we should be looking through when we talk about and examine European and Indigenous trade?
That was the main driving question that brought me to this project. That was, and in some places still is, kind of the central argument that scholars make and have made about the trade. I would say that Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous communities in the 18th century were reliant on the trade. It's a commercial culture, just like a lot of other places in the early modern Atlantic world are commercial cultures. I think one of the issues with that dependency argument, though, is that in some ways it's used to blame Indigenous people for the effects of colonialism. it's used to position colonialism and damage to Indigenous cultures as inevitable, and that Indigenous people are to blame for that. That use of European cloth and clothing were in some ways inherently damaging to Indigenous cultures, that Indigenous cultures inherently can't change and remain Indigenous. And I think it's used as a cover for the fact that things like coercive land treaties, dispossession, illegal settlement on Indigenous lands, and outright violence during the American Revolution was used to push people out of their territories, out of their lands. And in the Haudenosaunee case, I think there's more than a century of trade without that violence, where Haudenosaunee people were in control of their own territories, were in control of their own communities and trade. And it's not until the American Revolution that you see this huge, precipitous land loss. And that's an outcome that's coming from very specific choices by the Continental Army to use violence against Haudenosaunee communities. So I think positioning trade as somehow inherently damaging to Indigenous communities really downplays other kinds of colonial violence. Because you can absolutely, and one of the arguments that I make in the book, is that there was for more than a century trade without dependence, trade without culture loss. Because cultures can change over time. And one of the ways that you see that is the ways that cloth and clothing garments were integrated into Haudenosaunee communities in ways that were radically different from how contemporary European and settler communities were using them.
Yeah. And one of the things that we see when we study trade, especially with Indigenous peoples, are the different ways that Indigenous peoples have incorporated European goods into their lives in ways that Europeans just never imagined. Whether it was turning metal pots into jewelry by melting them down, or like you've said earlier, adjusting cloth and clothing so that Indigenous elements are added to it, and these pieces of cloth and clothing are just more aesthetically pleasing and culturally relevant to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, so the title of my book, Shirts Powdered Red, is from this 18th century description of Haudenosaunee clothing by Pierre Pouchot, who's the French commandant at Fort Niagara in the 18th century. And I picked that as the title of the book because I think it speaks to the real discomfort that Europeans had with that Haudenosaunee reuse. Pouchot's description kind of combines this fascinating anthropological detail, like he's really fascinated by the details of what this Haudenosaunee man that he's looking at and describing was wearing, including a white linen shirt that had been powdered red with vermilion pigment, with this real discomfort of a white linen shirt for European men is like the foundation of white masculinity at the time, that somebody is kind of civilized, adult, has political power in their community, is recognized as kind of a political actor. And Pouchot's discomfort with this shirt being powdered red and encountering that in a diplomatic situation, I think speaks to Haudenosaunee reuse, but also the tensions that created in cross-cultural contact in diplomatic situations.
Could we explore this discomfort that European men had a little bit further? I think in Shirts Powdered Red, you call it European material civility, which is a term that you use to describe the ideas that Europeans had about how the goods Haudenosaunee women traded for should be used. And then, of course, their ideas about the actual ways that Haudenosaunee women used European goods.
Yeah, there's a huge literature, scholarly literature about how Europeans are thinking about goods, and the consumer revolution literature is quite old by this point. And Europeans have this sense by the 18th century and the 17th century as well, that you have to be civilized in order to be Christian. And the French, the British, the Dutch are all very interested in the Christian conversion of the Haudenosaunee specifically. The French and the British, especially in the 18th century, because of the Haudenosaunee physical position between New France, New York, and the other British colonies. But also the Haudenosaunee are one of the largest military powers. They're very significant diplomatically to negotiations with other Indigenous nations. It's so extensive, in fact, that the British call the Haudenosaunee several times across the 18th century the key to all North America. So they're very invested in this idea of converting the Haudenosaunee to Christianity is necessary to tying them to either British or French political interests, explicitly as subjects of the British or French king, or just politically as allies, because they're so concerned that Haudenosaunee political sovereignty might mean that they could make their own military and political decisions, which could be disastrous. So conversion to Christianity is at the forefront of European concerns because of these political concerns. That ties into this issue of material civility because Europeans believe that people have to be civil in order to be Christian, that you can't be Christian if you're not civilized. And civility in this period has a lot to do with control of the body, control of communities, that the body ought to be regulated in specific ways to kind of suppress natural urges. A lot of that has to do with European style laundry, European styles of cleanliness and things like that. And clothing is a really foundational part of those ideas.
Maeve, would you tell us about the evolving nature of the politics of consumption and how after the American Revolution, Haudenosaunee women were able to keep their culture alive through their material expressions, their ability to use European and American goods in ways that were the most useful and appealing to them?
So the mid-19th century, after the American Revolution, Haudenosaunee people are forced into a series of really disastrous land treaties that reduces Haudenosaunee territories from basically all of what's now Western New York to less than a few thousand acres in some cases. And part of what's happening in this period is the American federal government, the Canadian government in the 19th century pushes what's called the civilizing mission. This idea that in order to be legitimate holders of their own ancestral lands, the Haudenosaunee and other groups, in order to remove removal, as happened to the Cherokee and so many other groups, had to become civilized in American or European context. And what that looked like was individual land holding, patriarchal heads of household, male agriculture with plows, etc. And in this period, the last chapter of my book, I look at the Parker family, and specifically this woman named Gahano Caroline Parker, who ended up being Lewis Henry Morgan's most influential, I think, informant on what became his first book, The League of the Haudenosaunee. It's this really foundational work for early American academic anthropology. And Gahano Caroline Parker's work with Lewis Henry Morgan, I think, speaks to how she and other Haudenosaunee women were thinking about their cultures in this period. So in 1848, Lewis Henry Morgan asked Parker to make what he called the most ancient and traditional costume of the Iroquois, both a set of men's clothing and a set of women's clothing. And both of these sets of clothing are still held by the New York State Museum. And he wanted these as examples of what we now call salvage ethnography. He had this idea that Haudenosaunee culture was disappearing. He wanted to document it, and he asked Parker to make these items in this context. And what Parker made, and she's on the cover of my book, a photo of herself wearing this set of women's clothing, is she made a set of clothing out of a red cotton overdress, a blue wool skirt, a blue wool wrapped blanket that echoes both modern Haudenosaunee women's regalia, ceremonial regalia that Haudenosaunee women were wearing in the early 19th century, but made of silk and velvet, and what Haudenosaunee women were wearing in the 17th and 18th centuries. And she made especially the cotton overdress really specifically out of red cotton cloth, because at the time that she was making these items, the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua was in danger of no longer being recognized by the U.S. federal government. And one of the most important things about the Treaty of Canandaigua is that it ensured the recognition of Haudenosaunee territories and the sanctity of their ancestral lands. And the annual payment for some of the lands that had been ceded under the Treaty of Canandaigua was made annually in red cotton cloth. So in the 19th century, at this point of the most significant danger to Haudenosaunee remaining lands, remaining sovereignty, Parker made this set of clothing that I think speaks to her own historical narrative of who the Haudenosaunee are and were. That this treaty securing their lands after the American Revolution was this centrally important part of Haudenosaunee identity, and that they would remain in their lands. And Parker she's like 21 years old at the point when she makes this set of clothing. And later in her life, she's known as like a very staunch advocate against removal. And I think you can see that thread in that set of clothing that she made.
Were you able to look at and examine the sets of clothing that Gahano Caroline Parker made as you did the research for your book?
Yeah, it's still held by the New York State Museum. It's not currently on display. It was actually in fairly poor condition at the time that I was writing the book, and it was only recently restored by a conservator. So it is still extant. Researchers can look at it. Haudenosaunee artists who are interested in the beadwork that Parker has done have gone and studied it, but it's not currently on public display.
Wow. I'm just thinking about being able to look at this clothing that Gahano Caroline Parker made. It must have just been an incredible source to look at and think about.
One of the things that I find really interesting and compelling about clothing as a historical source is how personal and intimate it is. I had spent a lot of time before I saw the dress reading about Parker and reading some of her letters, which is its own kind of intimate look at a person. But it was really different seeing this dress. The photo of her for a certain subfield is really iconic of her wearing this dress, but to actually see it in person and have a sense of the physicality of her as a person was really different. One of the things I also think about a lot is, as a white person, this is not my history. This is not my culture. I try to be very conscious of that. And I try to think about the things that I can't see. When I was writing this book, my grandmother passed away. My grandmother was the person who taught me how to sew, taught me about why clothing and women's work matters. And when I was packing up her house after her death, I was really struck by all of the things that her things don't speak to. And she was somebody that I knew in life that I spent a lot of time in my childhood with. And I didn't know her. And I try to be very conscious of that as a historian, that we can access people's thoughts in these ways, but they are never going to be direct. There's always historical distance.
Maeve, what do you think the legacy has been of Haudenosaunee women's work to trade for colonial goods and then to use those goods in distinctly Haudenosaunee ways? And I guess this is a two-parter because I'm also curious about how you think or hope this legacy will shape our ideas about Haudenosaunee women's work and culture.
So the Haudenosaunee are unique in some ways. In Eastern Native groups that had early contact with Europeans and what becomes the United States, they're unique in that the Haudenosaunee are some of the only groups that remain in their ancestral homelands in the 13 colonies. There are other groups that have reestablished reservations and reestablished recognition in those states or former colonies. But the Haudenosaunee are the only ones that have continually recognized reservations in their ancestral territories. So that's a bit unique. And I think that part of that comes from the very significant work that these women did in their communities to preserve their communities. There was a lot of pressure in the early 19th century for the Haudenosaunee to remove out of their ancestral territories. And women's work in preserving cultural sovereignty, political sovereignty, and allowing their communities to survive those pressures is one of the things that I think has allowed that to happen.
And now it's time for our segment 1776 in Context. Now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Maeve, in your opinion, how do you think your research into the power that Haudenosaunee women built and used in their trade with Europeans, and then their ability to use those trade goods to uphold and maintain their Haudenosaunee culture, helps us better understand the American Revolution and the Revolution's impact on Haudenosaunee nations and communities?
So the last couple of chapters of my book deal with this really specifically. Haudenosaunee women's cultural power, political power in their communities was so significant that it made them targets of political violence during the American Revolution. In 1779, the Sullivan-Clinton campaign was against Haudenosaunee territories that were at that point neutral, was the largest and most expensive campaign of the Continental Army to that point in the war. So in 1779, some nations of the Haudenosaunee, most significantly the Mohawk, were formally allied with the British. The Battle of Oriskany in 1777 was a pretty significant defeat of the Continental Army and American militias in facing Haudenosaunee allies of the British. So there's this concern by the midpoint of the American Revolution about Haudenosaunee military power. Many of the nations of the Haudenosaunee remained neutral fairly late in the war, but by 1779, those neutral nations and the British allied nations were considered so significantly dangerous to the continental efforts that the Sullivan-Clinton campaign very specifically attacked women's landholding, women's property, women's farms in Haudenosaunee territories to break that military power. So the Sullivan-Clinton campaign resulted in really a huge displacement of refugees. There wasn't a lot of casualties during the Sullivan-Clinton campaign among Haudenosaunee communities itself, but it targeted women and women's property specifically because of their pre-war power, their economic power, their cultural significance. And it was really aimed at devastating Haudenosaunee communities to the extent that they would not be able to aid the British. They were momentarily significant. The winter of 1779 to 1780 was really devastating for Haudenosaunee refugee communities. But in some ways, they were unsuccessful because the Haudenosaunee remain in their ancestral territories.
Maeve, what are you studying now?
Too many things. So I have 2 projects going right now. Like everybody else and their brother, I'm doing an American Revolution book because we're in the 250th. So one of the books that I'm working on is how the American Revolution has been commemorated between the 200th anniversary in 1976 and the 250th anniversary right now, specifically thinking about how people use cloth, clothing, and objects to tell those stories. So I'm looking at living history and historical reenactments and how that's kind of changed portrayals of the American Revolution. I'm also working on a digital humanities project looking at how people used ties of Christian baptism to create communities in early America. So beginning in the 17th century and going all the way past the American Revolution, how do we think about history at large scale, but also think about these kind of micro connections between people?
And if we have more questions about Haudenosaunee women and their early trade with Europeans, where's the best place for us to get in contact with you?
My professional website is maevekane.net, maevekane.net. And that's where I put things like links to podcasts that I'm on, places where I'm giving public talks. And I also put drafts in progress of my 2 ongoing projects up there as well.
Maeve Kane, thank you for joining us and for taking us through some of the Haudenosaunee history and the work and power that women have had in that history and in maintaining that culture.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz.
Maeve's research gives us a powerful look at how Haudenosaunee women were and are central to their communities, not just as caretakers, but as economic, political, and cultural forces. As Maeve noted, Haudenosaunee society is matrilineal, meaning identity and national belonging are passed down through the mother's ancestral line. This matrilineal system gives women influence in Haudenosaunee governance, especially when it comes to consensus-based decision-making. Now, one of the most striking examples that Maeve shared with us was how Haudenosaunee women used clothing and textiles as both cultural and economic tools. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European traders often misunderstood indigenous trade practices, assuming that women were passive participants. But as Maeve revealed, Haudenosaunee women actively controlled the distribution of goods like cloth, beads, and other trade items. Women also decided what their families wore in terms of clothing and how trade would shape their communities. Even after the American Revolution, Haudenosaunee women remained politically active. These women often frustrated American traders and diplomats with their presence because these men mistakenly thought that politics was a male-only sphere. But as Maeve pointed out, women had long been key decision-makers within their communities, and their involvement continued despite European and American ideas to the contrary. For more information about Maeve, her book, Shirts Powdered Red, plus notes, links, and transcripts for everything we talked about today, check out the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/406. Also on the show notes page, you'll find links to modern-day Haudenosaunee tribes and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy so that you can learn more about the Haudenosaunee in their own words. Again, visit benfranklinsworld.com/406. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, Maeve's research showed us how Haudenosaunee women used material culture to assert their identity and power. Can you think of other historical or modern-day examples where clothing or trade played a key role in shaping a community's identity? I'd love to hear what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.